Hello everyone, my name is Ergo Josh and welcome to my YouTube channel. Now today what I'm going to do is show you exactly how I would draw Billie Eilish from scratch in Procreate. So the first thing I would do is open up Pinterest and I would go ahead and search for Billie Eilish, but I already have the perfect photo of her to use for today. I'm going to go to my faces board and scroll down a little bit. Here we go. I think this one will be really kind of a little bit easier, but also really good to share the different techniques I want to show you today. So you just click on the three dots and then you hit download image and then it's saved to your photos gallery. So I just scroll up like that, swipe up, and then I go to Procreate. That image is kind of a portrait vertical image, so I usually work with a 4000 by 4000 canvas, but I think today I'm gonna just do the same thing and we'll figure out the details of like if we're gonna crop it or not after the fact. But then, so if you want to use the reference and look at it side by side while you're working, like I always do, swipe up, hold for a little bit, and then drag it over. Yeah, that's exactly how I do it normally. Then you would just swipe over to your recents and then pull up the image of Billie Eilish. And then I like to keep it half screen first, so it kind of forces me to focus on the details when I sketch. And I mean, the opposite of that, focus on the big picture when I sketch rather than the details. So that's how you get the image in and start working. So the next thing I would do is I would just go to the brushes and I would select my pencil eraser brush. This is a custom brush I've made to emulate pencils better because that's how I'm used to drawing traditionally. And I am going to use my pink color. And if you wonder why I use pink, I have a whole video on that. I'll link it somewhere along with my brushes. And I'm just going to quickly change the size and opacity to something I like. Make it nice and fairly large, but also light. Yeah. And so there's kind of two ways to go about sketching this. The first way would be to try to draw the head shape first and then place your details, your facial features in. But since this photo doesn't show the rest of the head, I'm going to focus on drawing the features first and then kind of massaging their location a little bit so that it's accurate. So first off, I'm going to start with the shape of the eye. So I'm just going to go ahead here. I'm probably going to time lapse a good portion of this, depending on if I have something to say to help you guys out or not, so that this video isn't super long. But I'm going to go ahead and do a nice almond shape here. Just looking at the reference. And what I think I'm going to do is, instead of going into detail with the shapes too quickly, I'm going to place them as best as I can. We're just kind of eyeballing it for now. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use this pointer like the mouse. It looks like a little mouse button, but we're going to use this arrow to move this a little bit more to the left. And I'm going to go ahead and kind of guess and approximate where her nose would be. I like to always start off with this oval shape to help me visualize the face a little bit more. It's very difficult to be able to visualize what you're going to draw onto the paper before you draw it, but you get better and better every time that you try. So I always start off with this with the nostril here, drawing the wing of the nose, and then we're going to go ahead, fill in more of the shape. You see a little bit of her left wing right there. It's a very kind of a big bulbous circular shape right there, so I'm going to go ahead and fill that in. Now I'm going to also, what I'm thinking now is, okay, what is the size of the nose in respect to the eyes? One thing that I personally do that some of you may find just as difficult is sizing things incorrectly in relation to the other details. So right now I'm feeling like the nose is a little bit big. I feel like the nose is just pretty close to the size of the eye. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to draw the rest of the kind of sub features for the eye, like the upper eyelid here. I just double tapped right now to switch to my eraser. I'm going to make sure my eraser is set to the similar brush so that we have a nice, good looking sketch. I'm going to draw a little bit of a line here just to represent the lower eyelid for now. And yeah, I think I'm going to go ahead and try to draw a little bit of the bridge. Just decided to loosely draw a little hint of it. I'm still not sure if the nose is as far down as I want or as long or as large as I want, but I'm going to go ahead and erase a little bit of the bridge for now because I really want to get that circular shape back, because her nose is very circular before it goes back up. And I'm going to draw in her mouth right here. Notice if the corner of the mouth is usually lined up with the edge of the iris, but we haven't drawn the iris in, so I'm just estimating right now it would be about there. So I'll go ahead and draw it in. The mouth usually has these different lines to it, depending on, you know, your genetics. These lines will be more apparent. Usually it's like that, so half your mouth will have those kind of lines there. Hers are very, very subtle. But I'm still going to draw them in as a guide. And now I'm going to go ahead and do the top of her lip. Starting to feel like her mouth is a little bit too wide. But I'm focusing on getting that upper shape in. I'm already noticing that the mouth is way too large and it's too close to the nose. So I'm going to go ahead and go to this tool right here, which is the lasso tool. And so I make sure it's on freehand and I draw a little circle around the mouth, and then I tap this little gray dot here. That finishes the selection. Then I can go to the moving tool and then I can shrink it a little bit and move it down like that. Just to where I think it should be. Go ahead and finish drawing the rest of the lips in. Going to draw this little, I believe it's called the Cupid's bow. I'm not sure what that anatomy is called, I always forget. But I'm going to draw in that little half moon shape there. To kind of help me check if things are placed correctly and sized correctly. I'm noticing her mouth is kind of, it's tilting a lot more and angled towards this direction. So I'm going to try to change my drawing a little bit in respect to that. So I'm using the lasso tool again to bring her lips in. This is the most difficult part of any portrait drawing, getting the basic sketch in and getting the features correctly placed. So don't worry if this takes you just as long as me or even longer, especially if you haven't warmed up today, because it's a very brain intensive exercise to do this, to be able to replicate something that you see. Just making minor adjustments here. And it's always going to look a little bit odd compared to the reference when you're doing a sketch. This is because, you know, you really need to have all of those values in there to be able to, you know, recognize a likeness. You'll be able to see this for yourself, because if I were to trace Billie Eilish here, you would notice if I just use lines to trace her features, she would look quite odd. She really wouldn't look quite like herself. And that's how you can usually tell if someone's traced a portrait versus actually hand drawn it. So I'm feeling like the eyes are a little bit too close. So I'm going to go ahead and select those and move them up. Make them a little bit bigger. And right now I'm just thinking about if they're too close together or they're too far apart. So I'm going to kind of draw an imaginary line here to connect the eye with the wing of her nose. I'm going to kind of mentally draw it here, and I can see that I need to move it a little bit more to the left. And if I were to do the same there, I feel like the eyes are in a pretty correct place, pretty good location. So a big part of Billie Eilish's look, I think, is also her eyebrows. So let's go ahead and draw those in. It helps to kind of think about, when you're trying to draw a character or likeness, what facial features are really going to be the biggest part of who they are. So for Billie Eilish, it's really her eyes. Her eyes are usually always half open, and it's her lips as well. So that look to her eyes and that look and her lips really characterize how she looks. So I'm starting to get a little bit doubtful of where I've placed some of these things now that I've drawn in the bridge of the nose. And go ahead and try to fill in this eyebrow here. This eyebrow looks much too close. So I'm trying to figure out, is it the eye? The eye could be too big, too far to the left, or the right eye could be too close to the middle. So I'm trying to think about which approach to take to solve this. I'm thinking it's definitely too close to the middle, because we definitely need this space over here. We need to make sure that that space kind of lines up and curves into the eyebrow. So now that we've kind of added in this edge to the nose, and we're looking at this, I see it needs to be a lot thinner. I'm going to go ahead and curve that up here. And that's just about where the eyebrow stops. I'm going to draw a little bit of a line here just to represent that kind of glossy part of her skin. I think her nose needs to actually be a little bit larger. So I'm going to go ahead and increase the size there. And erase these lines. You really don't want these lines to show in a sketch, because they're not really there in real life. And they can really have an effect on how your portrait is looking if you leave them there. It can make it difficult to tell if the portrait is looking like how it should. So what I'm going to do now is decrease the overall size of this and go ahead and start trying to block in her hair so that we can use that to help us check if this drawing is really getting close to how we should have it looking before we start shading. And draw a little bit of the hair here. I'm actually going to go ahead. I think what I'll do is I'll just arrange everything to the left like this and bring it in to where I think the corresponding edge would be over here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw in the hair on this side. I think this is really going to help us figure out how this drawing is going, and to test and see if the likeness is going well or not. You can see that her hair goes up like that, but then there's another layer of hair on top of that, so I'm going to start drawing that one. It cuts right about here. This is kind of making me aware that the eye is a little bit too flat. It needs to kind of curve more because it's really tucked in behind her nose, and she's facing this way. She's angled this way, so we really want to show that the eye is kind of peeling back. Not the eye, but it's sitting on a surface that's coming back up towards the nose, the bridge of the nose. I'm going to sketch in that shadow here. Draw another little shadow to represent where her upper eyelid is tucking in. And then her hair is in two pieces. Double tap to undo. I'm not even sure if I'd used undo at this point. I was trying to remember to tell you guys everything that I do, but if I haven't used undo, that's good, because with digital art, you really want to try to not to use undo as much. Ideally, you want to just use the pencil and use the eraser, because that's going to help you get a lot more confident with your sketching skills, and eventually you'll learn to do things right the first time rather than rely on the undo button or the lasso tool. But it's still very effective, and it's still going to be a lot better than if I were to use something like the grid method to go ahead and try to get the likeness correctly. You're still going to learn a lot more and build a lot more experience doing this manually with your freehand compared to using a grid. I'm going to just go ahead and cut the drawing where I think it should cut, just loosely. After drawing the hair in, I'm pretty confident with this. The only thing is I've noticed that the shadow needs to actually kind of hug the other side of her face more, so I'm going to go ahead and use the lasso tool and bring that more to the left. A little bit like that. And then I'm actually going to go ahead and bring the face in, bring the face to the right. I think there's a little bit more space in between her eye and where the hair is. So I'm just going to loosely let Procreate figure out how to fill that in. Click the move tool. Move it to the right just a bit. And then go ahead and draw the hair that's creating that shadow. Fill in the rest of the eyebrow. So now at this point, I'm really trying to figure out how tall her forehead is, because I don't think that the way I'm drawing it right now makes sense. It's a little bit too tall, but I'm just going to go ahead and fill it in because that way we can use the move tool to figure out exactly how tall we want to make it. And I'm going to draw a line just like that, and once it says line created, I can just move it around and it'll be a perfectly straight line. I'm going to actually redo that because what Procreate does is it stretches the line rather than generates one. So you really want to make it thick at first. That way you've got a continuous bold line to use. And I redid it just there because it wasn't as straight as I wanted it to be. I wanted it to be perfectly vertical, or at least as close to perfect as I can get it to be. And then I'm actually going to select it and move it into the left. Now that we've done that and she has like an impossibly tall forehead, I'm just going to slowly scale the drawing in both directions until it kind of fits. So we want to crop the drawing right about here at her chin and right around that comfortable distance for her forehead. As a matter of fact, we don't really need, all we need to do is make sure the forehead isn't bigger than it needs to be. And then just make sure the chin is where it should be. Just erasing these lines here that are a little bit just leftovers from some of the other mistakes that we made. Now what I'm doing is I feel like this does look like Billie Eilish, but I really want to avoid recognizing things later on when we're shading and then realizing that I have to fix them. So what I'm going to do here is click this and you get a little panel. I'm actually going to move this to the center. I'm using iOS 13, which is a beta, so that's why I'm having so many little issues here. Usually that little white thing is in the middle. But yeah, so I move that over there. Since I've kind of worked out the bigger details, I want to be able to focus more on my drawing and then use this less intensely because I can just zoom in if I need to see more detail. Yes, so what I was saying was I want to go ahead and click this little button in the center of the opacity and the scale sliders, and then there's a flip horizontally option, and I do that. And so what that allows me to do is you see it kind of with fresh eyes, and it helps you notice if there are any big mistakes. So far I'm not really seeing anything big. The only thing that looks weird is her left eye, but that's just because, we can't really see it, so we didn't really put any effort into drawing it correctly. So yeah, I'm pretty confident with how it looks here. I don't see anything that's crazy. And what I'm noticing here is her lips look like they're a little bit more pursed in the reference. So I'm going to lasso her lips over like that. I'm going to move them to the right. Just so her lips, because since she's facing to our right, since they're a little bit more pursed, they're going to actually appear as if they're moved to the right. You can tell here because this side is smaller than this one. Adding a little bit more detail here. And so now that I've placed everything, I'm going to go ahead and go add in some more details before we shade. So with the eye, I'm going to add in some thickness into the lower eyelid. I'm going to add in the iris and the pupil, and then loosely sketch in the eyelashes. Now what I'm going to do is actually switch to my pen pencil brush. Now this brush is a little bit more sharp. It's not as sketchy as the ones, the previous pencil eraser brush. It's a lot more dense, so I'm going to increase the opacity and then the size just a little bit. And I'm going to try and increase the size more, add a little bit of depth into her upper eyelid crease right there. And I'm rotating the canvas because I want to be able to get my best stroke for these lines instead of, if I were to try and do that stroke with my hand here, it would be wobbly, whereas if I do it like this, I can do it naturally and kind of piece them together. Normally, if you were doing this traditionally, you would be rotating your paper, and if you're new to the iPad or any drawing tablet for that matter, you're actually going to find yourself rotating the whole entire tablet, which is fine, but it's not going to look very pretty in the long run. So I encourage you to get used to rotating your canvas or keeping it steady, whichever. One thing that is also good to get used to is not zooming in as much, because you can't really do that in real life. So not zooming in as much helps you be able to focus on how the drawing looks, and you'll be able to see it at all times, and you'll just find that your sketches will naturally be better when you stay zoomed out for longer than if you zoom in and back and forth frequently. Once you're doing little details like this, it's not really as much of a big deal, but when you're beginning to lay out the sketch, you really want to limit how much you zoom in and out. Now I'm noticing that there's quite a bit of space here. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in some more lines to suggest hair, since we are going to be able to see her iris here and a little bit of her pupil. Her pupil should be halfway occluded by her upper eyelid, so I'm going to bring that eyelid down a little bit. I'm working on her lips now. I'm noticing that the left side right here needs a little bit more fullness to it, and I'm going to go ahead and start loosely marking in where I want the features, the little details of her lips to be. I'm going to mark in where the highlights are, some of the creases. I'm going to try and fix this line a little bit too. Now I feel like we've gotten a pretty good understanding of all of the features and where we want them to be. It looks like I moved her face a little bit too inwards for the hair, so I'm actually going to quickly pull her hair in. You don't really need to be this precise when you're doing your own portraits, because of course that's not going to make a difference for how this looks. But I just want you to be able to see all of the tools that are available to you when you want to go for a more accurate drawing. So now we're going to get into shading this. So to start off shading, what I like to do is I create a new layer and I move that layer down like that. And I will take, usually if I'm drawing in grayscale, I'll take a light gray, but since we're doing this in pink, I'm going to fill this canvas with a pink color. Like this, and then I'm going to go back to the layers and double tap on them. That will allow me to change the opacity of that layer. I'm going to move it down, and let's move it down to she's pretty fair skinned, so I'm going to move it down to about, let's do 21%. And so now we have a good base for her skin tones, which is going to make it a lot easier for us to add highlights and to add the shading that we need later. So for the shading, I'm going to do another approach that I like to do, which is similar to how I like to sketch. I'm going to go back to the original layer, and what I like to do with shading portraits like this, I like to start by shading the features and kind of ignore the rest of the skin. So I'm going to start with the eye here, and I'm going to use a mixture of just my pen pencil brush to add in a lot of the darker parts like the pupil and the eyelashes, and draw some of the finer lines like in the eyebrows. But I'm also going to utilize my hard skin brush to do some of the more detailed parts of the skin, and then I'm going to use my soft noise brush, which is kind of my skin brush, and I'm going to use that to add a little bit more smoothness and variation to the textures that you're going to see on the skin. I think I'll speed this part up and do both eyes and then come back later. What I'm using the soft noise brush to do right now is to fill in areas that are darker, and just quickly establish those as darker areas so that you can give yourself more information to work from when you're starting to add in more and more detailed shading. You want to go from large to small. So I start off with my biggest brush, get the most important information in, and then start going into the details. This tool right here I haven't mentioned yet is the smudge tool. So I like to use this with the hard skin brush to kind of smudge away any guidelines that I sketched so far, like the ones for the eyebrow or the lower eyelid here. And I also use it to smooth areas that I've loosely shaded so that they blend more into a skin texture. So like for example, this area right here where I drew 2 lines, I would use the smudge tool to kind of blend that first line out and blend the crease into the rest of the skin so it smoothly fades away. When doing eyelashes, you really want to make sure your brush is fairly small and fairly dense, and try to make sure that they are following a good, smooth, consistent pattern. Don't make them point to the left, up and down. You want to make sure they're kind of going up and slowly radiating around the surface of the upper eyelid. I found the best way to get them is to just take it very slow and be very patient, because otherwise they can quickly become look very random and not very good to look at. Usually with eyelashes like this, I would also make another layer, but I think what I'm going to do is I'm not going to really go too super detailed with this drawing since it's just a demo. But normally you would really want to make something as delicate as these eyelashes on their own layer. That way you can manipulate the skin below them if you haven't focused on drawing the skin yet. One thing I also forgot to mention and do is usually before I start shading, I create a copy of the sketch so that I can use it later in case I end up erasing something that I need to check back on. So it's not too late. I'm just still going to duplicate this right here, and then I'm going to hold it and bring it down and hide it there so that we can have it for later. At any point during this whole time, you can always feel free to have a little fun and do things in your own style if you want. So for me, that's the way I want this crease to look. I'm not really looking at the reference. I want it to look a certain way. I want her skin to look a certain way. So I'm just doing those things as I go along. It's always good to do that. It gives your art some more flair to it, and it makes it stand out versus compared to anyone else who would draw the same reference or even the photo itself. We can really focus on, we don't have to worry too much about this eye in the corner because it's going to be kind of blurry and occluded with the hair. So just like how animators do, we can rely on the darkness to leave a lot of the information up to the imagination. An important thing you also want to do with eyes, especially Billie Eilish's eyes, is there's a shadow cast by the upper eyelid. So you want to, I'm actually going to use my basic brush, which is basically, you know, your Photoshop soft brush. And I'm going to go in and make the opacity lower, make the brush bigger, just add a nice shadow. You might be wondering why I'm not drawing any of the highlights, and that's because I try my best to do as much as I can with the shadows before I add the highlights, because I want to make sure I'm paying as much attention as I can to each step of adding values, because things can quickly feel like they're finished when you add highlights, and so I like to save those kind of exciting parts till later. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is go ahead and start the nose. The nose is usually my favorite thing to shade because it's super easy. It's the closest thing to, like, you know, your typical sphere ball shading practice. So with this, I just like to use a soft brush to again get the basic values in there. Notice where the areas of darker shade are, so around the nose, the most bulbous part, and then of course on the right side where there's a lot less light hitting her face. under the nose on the right side, and then of course inside the nostril. And the nose is also a nice challenge oftentimes, because you'll find that the wing of the nose, even though it always looks like it has a very sharp crease, never really has a line to it. So you really have to work on your edge control and be able to blend it in such a way that it looks like there's an edge, but there really isn't one. There's a lot of subtle value changes in the nose, but it's a very simple geometry, so it's fun because it's challenging, but at the same time it's easy. I like using my hard skin brush or the mixed brush when I want to really blend out areas that are very rough, like this, where I'm really just trying to get rid of a lot of random guesswork strokes. I try to avoid nowadays using my soft noise brush to blend, because it kind of over blends it too much. I usually only use that when I'm creating a base for the skin, which is you're actually going to see me do when I start shading the skin for the rest of the face, and not just focusing on the features here in a moment. So you can see very quickly we've already gotten the nose to look pretty close. I'm going to go ahead and add this shadow. I think it's pretty important and should stand alone without really worrying too much about the rest of this face shading. If you notice, I never really worked on that eyebrow. It's because I like to leave eyebrows kind of to the end, because they don't really, as far as, you know, the likeness is concerned, it already looks good. And it's really something that I tend to rework a lot, and I want to make sure that the skin looks good and everything else looks good before I spend too much time on it. Because there's still a part of me that thinks that I may end up shifting things a little bit. So I want to do the least I can to shade things before I move into the more finer details like that. Really trying my best to work to clean up these edges here so that they're edges, but they still have a nice soft feel to them. So like, for example, this edge right here of just darker tone, I want to add that in without it looking too harsh. Same thing with this edge here where there's darker skin beyond the nose. Since I come from drawing with graphite pencils, I really do like the approach of using a very sloppy method to shade, and then coming back in and then blending it very with a lot of detail to get it to look exactly how I want. I find personally trying to shade in this way very detailed from the start is very difficult to do with digital art, because it just doesn't compare to the fine nuance of control that you have with a real pencil in real life. So I say, well, why not take advantage of an infinite canvas like this and, you know, place value down like a painter would, and then manipulate the paint rather than try to place the paint down exactly how it would be. So now I think I'm going to go ahead and move on to the mouth, and the mouth is also going to be of second most importance, and it's also going to be a little bit challenging here because we really want those edges to be very smooth, like in this area, for example. And it's a lot of where Billie Eilish's character is, and so we really want to make sure that it has the correct values. So I like to start again with this soft noise brush to slowly add value in, starting from the center of the mouth. That's where there's going to be the most tone, and I'm just going to add value in, and already it's starting to look a lot more like Billie Eilish. So I'm going to start going more detailed, and the first thing I'm going to try and do is get rid of these edges that I drew with my pencil and make them tonal changes. So it's going to be this color, then it's going to be this color, and then that's going to happen very quickly, and that's going to look like an edge. And so I'm going to do that, start adding the darkness in between, the ambient occlusion in between where the lips touch together, and then I'm going to start adding the different value changes in there before I do the highlights later on. ahead and actually go back on my word. Her eyebrow looks a little too thick, and so I'm going to go ahead and start adding some detail to it by erasing some of those areas you see where the skin is revealed. I like to do too much and then come back and add more with my pencils. Use a pen pencil brush for this, and make it a little bit similar to the eyelashes, but a little bit softer. You can see the right eyelash, or her left eyebrow, is pretty much blurred and in the background, so I'm not going to add any strokes there. You just want to do a lot of crisscross patterns. You can see there's a little bit of a guideline there still, so I'm going to go ahead and blend that away. I'm happy with that for now. And so now what I'm going to do is, I believe I'm going to start the overall skin shading. And so to do that, what I want to do is zoom out fully, create a new layer under our sketch / shading layer, and I'm going to take my soft noise brush and make it very large and fairly low opacity, and I'm going to start adding in shadows. So where the hair is casting a shadow on the face, a shadow under her lip, the shadow cast by her nose. I'm going to zoom in here and try to fade it into that very dark line that we made. I like to try to keep the brush size fairly large because we get this nice texture. The skin texture is really, really nice once you're able to cover the whole drawing with this brush. Now I'm going to add the shadow here with the Cupid's bow. And now I'm just going to cover the whole right side of the face in shadow and add a little bit of hints of shadow to the rest of her face. So for example, an important place would be right under her eye on this side, and then this side of her nose, the bridge, the other side of the bridge of her nose. There's a gradient on her forehead, dark on the right side, and then it goes lighter to the right, to the left side. So I'm going to start that. And keeping this brush big is going to allow us to really keep that nice skin texture in, as you can see there. And so the more we build, the more and more this is going to look like realistic skin at the end. So I'm going to keep working on this, and I will catch you back later with whatever I decide the next step is going to be. I'm actually going to quickly go into the layer above and blend away these loose areas of sketch guidelines. The larger the skin brush is, the better. That way you get as much of the texture in as possible. I want to make that corner of her nose more apparent. Try your best to make the shading smooth without resorting to blending, that way you can keep the texture. I have yet to find a brush that can blend while maintaining texture, at least in Procreate. Now I'm going to come into the eye and add the shading right above the upper eyelid and right below the eyebrow. You want to leave some room for the highlights, but don't be afraid to add a little bit of value there. That way the highlights can pop, and that way you really want every surface to be covered with the brush, at least somewhat, rather than to be left alone, no matter how fair-skinned the person is, if you're going for this semi-realistic style. Or is this realism? I'm not up to date on my terminology. I'm sure you've noticed by now I really don't use too many of the different features in Procreate when I'm doing my portraits. Because again, the big reason I like Procreate is because of how close it is to drawing traditionally. That's really the reason why I got the iPad, because I was doing traditional sketches to train, but I loved digital art so much that when I heard that the iPad was available and I heard Procreate was such an effective program, I got it, and I haven't looked back since. So now, for the part you all have been waiting for, I am going to start doing the highlights. I'm going to quickly get in some darker values for her eye here. And just for fun, let's take a look at how the shading looks without the face that we drew. So let's hide that layer. One tip that I like to do is you can do something like this, or you can actually go ahead and hide the background layer. And this helps when you turn it up to full brightness. This can help you to identify areas of the shading that's a little bit too rough, that needs some attention for you to kind of smooth it out. So this area could be smoothed out a little bit more. And so I'm going to try my best to smooth it out by shading lightly rather than by using the blending tool, so that we can again keep the nice texture of this brush. I'm not really going to worry about, if I can see the rest of the drawing or not. I'm really just going to focus on trying to make the values blend into each other very nicely, because it's all a continuous surface, so the values should blend nicely into each other. As you can see here, it gets a little bit messy and awkward, so I'm just going to lightly come back over it with several strokes to mesh it back together. This also works well. The kind of black and white technique where you hide the white layer also works very well when you have everything showing. So then you can really identify small areas that may be too messy. I can't really use that technique now because the lighting from my camera is preventing me from seeing all of the details, but this is something that I do use very often to help my blending look as best as it can. So now I'm going to add back in our background layer and add a new layer for highlights. So for highlights, what I like to do is I like to use a special brush. I have two brushes called sparkle brushes. One is for larger sparkles. It's more for like background or jewelry. But the smaller one is for, or I also use this bigger sparkle brush for like little noise details, like the hair in my last portrait of my Zima Blue gender bend. But this sparkles brush is something I used for highlights because it's very reminiscent of the very textural feel you have when you look at highlights on the face. So I'm going to continue to go in and add these highlights in as I see them. There are some very key areas, like above. This is a very round shape, so there's going to continue to be highlights coming down the eye, and so there's going to be highlights in this area. I want to be very careful with this brush. It can very quickly look overdone. The amount of overdoneness it can look depends on your preferred style, of course. I like to add some highlight for the nose here. I always like to use this brush instead of using just a very hard brush. I want it to look very realistic, like there's skin and there's oils. That's really the intent of using this brush for highlights. And I'm going to add a little bit of highlighter on her face, even though it's not as present, just for fun, just to really emphasize the skin texture. I'm also going to come up here and add a little bit, make the brush as large as I can, just add some little granular effects there. Come back here, add a little bit to the wing of her nose. And now let's go ahead. I like to use my pencil eraser brush to add highlights to her lips, because there's a little bit of noise there, but it's definitely not as noticeable as if I should use the sparkles brush. The highlights on the lips can take a little bit of practice to get used to, a little bit of work and reworking. Try to keep your strokes following the shape of the lips. And when you get into areas like these, make sure there's a dark area next to the highlight, so that it looks like it creates depth, gives the illusion of depth. It's good to work zoomed out, because a lot of times how it looks zoomed out is going to help you figure out what details to add. It's one technique that I like to use for the lips, since it isn't skin, is to blend this out very often and come back over and do it over and over again. I'm going to go ahead and go to the last layer and blend out the planning lines that I did. Come back to the highlight layer. Now these two areas of the lips are actually fairly bright, so I'm going to go ahead and use my basic brush to increase the overall value of these areas, because the upper lip was looking a little flat. I'm going to darken the right side of the upper lip, and we want to maintain the darkness of the crease there. At this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to merge all of my skin layers so that it's easier to blend them and understand what's going on, and keep the highlight layer separate. And now what I'm going to do is quickly block in the hair with just a pure white. I'm not going to focus on drawing the hair for this tutorial because I feel like it's already gone on too long. But brushes that I like to use for the hair would be my pen pencil brush for blocking it in. I also use my chunk brush because it's usually, for most hair types, it's a good all-purpose brush for adding details in there. And then I like my hair strand brush for actually using with any form of hair strand. Actually, I do often use them for eyelashes as well, but for the little flyaway hairs, I like this hair strand brush a lot. So you're going to see me use all of them, and hopefully you can still get something out of it, even though it'll be sped up. I'm going to make another layer for the hair as well. And now I'm going to go ahead and use my pen pencil brush to add in some highlights to the eyes. And so I forgot to mention these highlights previously. They're fairly important when it comes to highlights. You want to add some highlights on the ridge of the lower eyelid. I almost always add these regardless if the reference shows them or not, because, you know, adding wetness to things just makes them look realistic no matter what you're doing. I'm gonna add some here. I'm gonna add a little bit of a waterline right here. And I'm going to brighten up this area a little bit. I think I'm gonna use my soft noise brush just to make it not too super smooth. And yeah, I think what I'm gonna do to help this look a little bit better is I'm gonna add another layer. I'm gonna try to block out this area so that's easier for us to appreciate the drawing. What I'm going to do now, actually I need to make it a little bit closer so that we erase all that pink. Nice. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add a little bit of line work detail to this. This is something that I do just because it's my own style. I like to mix in a little bit of lines, and I like to use a variant of a pink color, but you don't have to do this, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of artists that say not to do something like this, but it really all depends on your style. And so I like to kind of add in areas to emphasize the lighting. I don't remember making a group, that's odd, but yeah, add in some darker areas to emphasize the forms. And I was rearranging the layers because I wanted these darker lines to be under the highlights, but also to be able to affect the hair. So I'm going to add some of these, and I will give you some finishing thoughts on this piece. Just adding some finishing touches now. And now we are pretty much done. The only thing left I would add to this is just cleaning up some of the shadows and helping her face shape, maybe tweaking it a little bit with the liquify tool. Really quickly I can show you what I mean. If I go to her face layer and I take the liquify tool, I can scale up the size and push in, scale it up pretty big and push in a little bit here to kind of round that face up a little bit. But other than things like that and just adding a little bit more detail here and there until the piece gets to a very, very nice level where I can scan it all, make sure it looks great for Instagram, you know. But that's pretty much it. That's everything I wanted to show you guys. Thank you so much for watching. And if you like this video, like, subscribe. If you want to see more videos like this, also let me know. If you drew along to this, please, you know, hit me up on Instagram, tag me in it. I'd love to see what you guys have made. And until the next video, keep drawing and stay positive. Peace.